I will now introduce Jeffrey Sachs, who has been with us for a minute. Sachs is co-founder and chief strategist of the Millennium Promise Alliance, a non-profit organization dedicated to ending extreme poverty and hunger. From 2002 to 2008, he served as director of the Earth Institute at Columbia University, where he is now director of the Center for Sustainable Development. Sachs has worked since 2001 as special advisor to several UN Secretary Generals, leading the UN's work on the 8 Millennium Development Goals, which were decisive for development efforts of the whole world during the 2000 to 2015 period, and then subsequently the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are currently the lodestar of development efforts and will be so until 2030. They cover the period between 2015 and 2030. Sachs is one of the world's top experts on sustainable development, economic development, and the fight against poverty. And we are extremely grateful that he's giving us his time to be with us and discuss with us today. Professor Sachs, please.
Let me speak for just a couple of minutes because I'm coming in cold, and then I can address topics that you would like. I think there are a number of topics on the table on financing, and one that Thomas is discussing right now is the financing of innovation and the multiple kinds of approaches that can be used. Patents as a one vehicle, which has the advantages of decentralization and the disadvantages of granting market power to innovators versus various kinds of public financing, which have the big advantage of potentially enabling technologies to be produced at marginal cost rather than at monopoly prices once innovations take place. There are many additional financing issues that I just want to put on the table from the point of view of any of our sustainable development goals. Indeed, I think when we watch COP'26 or the G20 process, to my mind, finance is at the center of the issues from start to finish, because basically poor countries do not have adequate financing for achieving sustainable development. And the financial system that we have privileges the high-income world tremendously, enabling vast amounts of borrowing at almost no cost, whereas developing countries, if they try to finance investments or public services or the budget on a market basis, they are paying a remarkable penalty for that compared to what the high-income world pays. And I don't think that it's based on fundamental differences of risk. It's based on power and institutional differences in my mind. So just to put some concrete ideas on the table, the SDGs call for major increases of spending by governments for health, education, and a variety of infrastructure needs, clean energy, water, sanitation, sewerage, urban infrastructure, digital connectivity, and the like. The dominant fact of the SDGs is that the levels of budgetary spending needed to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, whether it's universal access to healthcare or to education or to clean energy or other goals, is simply far beyond the budgetary means of the developing countries, especially the low-income countries and the lower middle-income countries. That is the fundamental story of the Sustainable Development Goals. Poor countries cannot achieve them on their own budgetary means. If they try to borrow funds for the budget in order to finance infrastructure or to finance education spending or healthcare spending, they would find that the terms of borrowing are onerous. For example, interest rates of 5 to 10% per year on, say, 20-year borrowing compared to interest rates of 1% per year that the developed countries would pay for their borrowing. So the bottom line is that the Sustainable Development Goals are not being achieved because they cannot be financed. A finance minister in Africa said to me recently, for example, that his budget does not even permit universal access to primary education, much less secondary education, which is what's called for in SDG 4. The Paris Climate Agreement is essentially the same story. It's got variations on this theme, but developing countries cannot finance the three major categories of climate finance that are necessary. Those three are mitigation through energy transformation, climate adaptation, and responses to climate disasters or so-called losses and damages. The budgetary costs of these three categories of climate finance are way beyond the budgetary means of developing countries. As everybody knows, the high-income countries long ago in 2009 promised at a minimum $100 billion of financing per year as of 2020 for the developing countries. The actual amount is heavily contested because the rich countries give themselves their own report cards, but it's less than 100 billion for sure. And according to some estimates, it's probably 20 billion maximum. According to the rich countries' own estimates, it's closer to 80 billion, but even with faked numbers, they couldn't put it at $100 billion. So as we observe in the COP conference just now, there's no agreement on timelines or even core principles, in part because developing countries are saying they cannot afford to make strong commitments that will fail because they can't finance the strong commitments that are being made. So my own view is that both for the SDGs and for the Paris Climate Agreement, finance is a centerpiece of the puzzle that is unresolved. You're also discussing another related set of issues, which is the costs of access to, well, the costs of promoting innovation and then the costs of access to new technologies, of which COVID vaccines are probably the leading case this year. Though it should also be added that it's not only the cost of the vaccines that have prevented poor countries from getting them, it's the fact that the vaccines are produced in rich countries and the United States imposed an export ban on vaccines. So even if poor countries wanted to buy the vaccines, they weren't allowed to by the United States, all of which underscores the importance, the unreliability of the trading system and the importance of all countries having technological capacity, not just depending on the goodwill of a few high-income countries to produce the goods that they need. But to a significant extent, the vaccine issue is also a finance issue that is of a similar kind, and there are many other health innovation issues that are basically finance issues. my main observation is none of this is seriously addressed in global diplomacy right now, because the main prerogative of rich countries is not to talk about it. The United States does not enter into any serious discussions on international development finance in any venue. And also in our twisted ideology in this country and politics, probably any such financing would not pass the Congress, which is filled with the triumphalist, nationalistic, white supremacist premises from the start. So we can't get financing from the United States for these issues. Europe's a bit better, not decisively better, let's say. And Europe has been, the European Union has been pretty much uninterested in the issues of access to vaccine technology this year, even repudiating or rejecting the rare US, at least rhetorical, call for sharing vaccine technology with developing countries, waiving IP. The European Union rejected that. So my basic observation is we don't have a serious discussion of development finance in the world right now that is up to any of the tasks that we face on the SDGs or in climate. Most of the venues where these issues are discussed are hortatory at best, non-quantitative, non-problem solving, with rare exceptions. The exception this year was the special drawing rights, which is a step forward, though a modest step, because these are reserve assets, not really development finance. But I would still say this was a modest step forward. But on other issues of how to finance healthcare, education, green infrastructure, losses and damages, climate adaptation, biodiversity conservation, there's very, very, very little serious discussion of financial systems, structures, amounts, flows, direction, risk sharing, and so forth. There's no concept, which I like, but no one shares it, of a global fiscal redistributive system along the lines of a kind of global social democratic approach. Interestingly for me also, within the European Union, which is an aggregation of social democratic countries that collect a lot of domestic tax revenues, there's also no will for turning the European Union into a multilateral social democratic economic space. It remains basically national budgets for 27 countries with very little redistribution among the 27 countries. A little bit of breakthrough this year, but not very much. So transboundary finance, development finance, is still extremely small, extremely limited in a world of strong interdependence, bold goals, deep divisions, major needs. We don't have a financial system globally, a budgetary system globally, a system of international financial institutions globally that is at all compatible with the goals that we've set. Finally, I would say one of the things I've tried to do in recent years is to show the numbers that are involved in meeting the SDGs or meeting the climate objectives, and then compare them with the actual financing that is available. And I worked with the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department during the past 3 years in a number of exercises, and the IMF has done a very creditable job showing that low-income developing countries need to spend vastly more than they do out of the budgets on sustainable development objectives, but that they lack the financing to do so. And even after the IMF puts in bold assumptions about increased domestic tax revenues, better administration, more efficiency of spending, and so forth, the IMF acknowledges that there is a fundamental financing gap for the SDGs. And that financing gap is on the order of $300 to $500 billion a year for the low-income developing countries. Interestingly, in my mind, they find the gap, but they don't recommend anything to do about it, because that would entail getting into the political economy of the global distribution of income. So the gap is there. It's quite plainly described, quite directly and skillfully described, but not solved. And the IMF board did not have the curiosity to say, well, what should we do about this gap? And that's because the IMF board is dominated by the rich countries that don't actually want to acknowledge this kind of financing gap. The amounts involved, finally, let me just say, are large if you're poor and small if you're rich. So if the financing gap for the SDGs is $500 billion a year, that is 0.1 of 1% of the GDP of the rich countries. And I'm sorry, that is 1%, excuse me, 500 billion is 1% of the GDP of the rich countries. And it's 0.5% of the worldwide GDP. So I regard that as a modest amount if we wanted to solve the global problems of health, education, and infrastructure, 1% of the income of the rich world. But it's way beyond anything that is discussed right now. And there is very little serious discussion of how to close the gap. Maybe I'll end with a typical example. The gap for funding universal access to primary and secondary education is somewhere between $50 and $100 billion a year to bring maybe 300 million school-aged children into school in poor countries. But when the rich countries get together to pledge funding for education, they do it in an initiative called the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, which is a Washington-based institution, which aims to raise $1 billion a year, even though the financing gap is probably $50 billion a year. So the aim of GPE is ridiculous in my mind. I say don't even try, because you're filling up our airwaves and you're confusing the issue. So better you close rather than raise $1 billion a year, because we need to raise something closer to $50 billion a year. And so if you have the wrong target, you're not being helpful. But this is an example of how rich countries get together and they declare that they're doing something, but what they're doing is at a scale that is completely irrelevant and distortive of what's really needed, even though what's really needed, say 50 billion a year, is 0.1 of 1% of the income of the rich world, but the rich world doesn't care very much whether poor children in poor countries go to school or not. So that's the bottom line. So Thomas, just a few quick thoughts on the overall financing topic.
Great, thank you very much, Jeff. And let me ask you the obvious question, and that is this financing gap that you described can basically be filled in two different ways, right? You can give money to the poor countries so that they can afford more to buy more of what they need, or you can try to make the things that they need cheaper, and in particular, remove artificial price barriers like intellectual property rights, as we are proposing with the Green Impact Fund for Technologies and also with the Health Impact Fund. And my question is one of those two ways, or is that specific way that we are advocating, is that one that might have advantages either in terms of being effective and efficient in actually getting things done in the developing world? And secondly, is it potentially something that is politically more palatable because it brings out a little bit that we have a kind of redistribution from south to north in the system as it is, right? The overwhelming amounts of money that are flowing on the basis of patents are flowing from or towards the north. And so the south is paying probably tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of embedded monopoly markups to the north as it is, something that we might say we should free them of. And so could we maybe make a better, stronger argument, get more traction in the rich countries if we advocated for something like the impact fund financing mechanism that we've been working on?
So I think the answer is we need both approaches, but they are not substitutable case by case. So there are areas where the technology issue is really important. There are areas where the requisite goods and services are basically produced at near marginal cost. There's very little markup, and then it's just a direct cost problem, not necessarily a sharing or technology problem. So the area that is, probably most notorious for huge markups is pharmaceuticals, because that is a system of design monopoly, and this is why already 20 years ago with AIDS, with the antiretrovirals, it was really important to create a kind of system. In that case, it was the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB, and Malaria, combined with so-called tiered pricing, in which the pharmaceutical industry provided the antiretrovirals at production cost to the developing countries and to the Global Fund. In that case, the difference was enormous because an annual regimen of antiretrovirals was $20,000 at market prices and about $200 at production costs, so 100-fold margin. And the approach of getting these technologies available at cost was fundamentally important. And I think that that is true in some selected areas, but I would check in what areas are these markups so large. Interestingly, by the way, with the COVID vaccines, the markup is probably 10 to 20 times. When Moderna or Pfizer sell the vaccine at $30 a dose, it's probably compared to a production cost of $1 to $2. So there is a significant markup there. There's even worse. There's a Q that has little rationality and no measure of fairness in it, just direct power. So that's another element in the story. I think there are other areas of technology where we have the ability now to dramatically lower the cost. Our own sector, production sector, universities is probably one of them, where because we can teach on Zoom, I think the marginal cost of a good high-level education is probably maybe a 50th of the tuition that our universities are charging right now. So I proposed to Columbia last year that we make a master's degree for African students online at a price point of about $1,000 per student, but I couldn't interest the university for some reason in that. I'm still working on that project actually with some African entrepreneurs to provide a no-profit, very low-cost online master's degree in sustainable development. And that's another example where there's a phenomenal markup that I think it can be diminished. Healthcare is filled with those in other areas. We can now probably read X-rays almost for free on AI systems that are as good or better than established human systems. And so I also have long wondered about our digital libraries at our universities. You know, we have instant access to tens of thousands of journals, which has fundamentally transformed and benefited, I think, our research capacities. But a student in a poor country has no access to those. The marginal cost of providing that access is probably about zero, but we haven't done that. So I think that there are many areas where effectively open source or technology transfer or tiered pricing or funded direct innovation has an important role to play. But there are many areas where marginal cost pricing prevails, and there's just an enormous gap of what can be purchased, and that needs direct finance.
Right. Do you have time for another question, or?
Yeah, I think one more, and then I think I have to run.
Any question from anybody?
One of the important features of many of the sort of efforts to push the SDGs in developing countries is that the financing has to come from rich countries and then go to poor countries. To what extent do you think it's helpful to have a strategy in which that's mediated through rich country corporations? So the financing goes to rich country corporations who provide goods and services.
That's interesting. That's an interesting idea. I've been thinking mostly about how we could actually create a regime of global taxation so that this is not rich countries providing so-called aid to poor countries, but is a global fiscal system that allocates revenues in a more hospitable way. Your idea of rich countries providing financing to their own companies to provide services, of course, is what export credit agencies do. It's what bilateral donor agencies do to some extent. From a political economy point of view, it's not awful. I'm generally in favor of competition where different countries finance their own companies to provide something useful. China's doing that a lot right now in Chinese companies building infrastructure in Africa. And I think that's basically fine, although the terms of each of these agreements and the quality of the financing and the investment needs to be scrutinized. But basically, we should try to systematize this rather than see it as. I think your idea is clever and right, from a political economy point of view. It won't lead to optimal development by any stretch of the imagination, but it does lead to some resources. Thomas, you're on mute.
One more. We have Talia from Lebanon.
Yeah, I have one more minute, so
okay,
it has
Talia.
to be a quick one.
Okay,
Unmute
I'll try to
yourself.
be very quick. Expecting developing countries to actually work on their own and manufacture whatever they need to rise up is a little bit too hard to believe, because they are run politically by superpowers, as we all know. And I wonder whether there is a global moral obligation for colonial countries, let me use that word, to give back to the other countries that were colonized, but from whom they took everything that they built their economy on. I'm trying to make it very brief. Thank you.
Yeah, well, in principle, yes, but in practice, you don't want to put the colonial power as the one that is bilaterally in charge of solving the problem, because the colonial relations are not over by any means. And so historical responsibility, yes. Bilateral responsibility, I would say no. I would try to multilateralize almost anything. We've got to get past this colonial era, which still completely persists in many countries, where the former colonial power still manages and manipulates the national economy and national politics to an important extent. But there is historical responsibility. If the United States hates, if US political ideology hates two ideas more than any other ideas in the world, one is global tax system, because the US elite hates taxes and especially hates the idea that there should be any global responsibility on taxes. And second, it is historical responsibility. That's, I think, the essence of being rich is impunity, and the essence of impunity is you're not responsible for past actions. So this is a very hard part of development. It's why China's breakthrough is so important and interesting and special. It's one of the very few cases in modern history of a country that is developing outside of the aegis of a powerful pre-existing standard bearer. And that's why the US hates what's happening in China so much, because it's actually a self-generated development to a very large extent. And it is seen as a fundamental challenge to US primacy. And so achieving this more generally is very hard, but China by itself provides some counterweight, I think, that is useful in my view. I believe we need a more multipolar world and multilateral institutions rather than bilateralism within that multipolar world.
Okay, Jeff, thank you very much. We have to let
Thanks a lot. Sorry to be so brief, but I know somebody's waiting. So great to see all of you, and thanks for your leadership on this crucial topic.